for them, okay? Whereas for most Protestants, and I would say Roman Catholic nowadays, the Masoretic text or the Hebrew text is the authoritative source. There's just a little problem because when you get to Yered, number 6 on that list, I hope you can see it. X represents the age of Yered when he actually gave birth to his first son. The Masoretic text says he was 162 years old, whereas the Samaritan Pentateuch says he was 62, and Septuagint says he was 162. So what do? Well, if you look at the Masoretic text column X, you will realize that the numbers decrease. You start with 130 under Adam, Seth is 105, Enosh 90, Kenan 70, Mahalalel 65, and then you would have expected what? 62. And that's exactly what the Samaritan Pentateuch has. Okay? When you get to Methuselah, for instance, he was 187 years old when he begot his first son. The Samaritan Pentateuch says he was 67, but the Septuagint says he was 167. So which one is right? Well, you have to pick one of those, but depending on what you pick, you're going to come with different ages. Very good. Now, if you actually count all this, add up all these numbers, even in the Masoretic text, you're going to discover that the year of the flood was the same year when Methuselah died. Did he die during the flood? If so, why no word about it? And this genealogy of Adam is supposed to be a good genealogy. So was he not righteous just like Noah was? See, a natural reading of the text, as Ken Ham would say, creates problems. But let's say you choose the Samaritan Pentateuch tradition. If you go with that tradition, then you have a little bit of another problem. Yered, Methuselah, and Lamech, they all died in the flood. Were they all unrighteous as well? But most interesting, if you go with the Septuagint tradition, Methuselah lives to 2,256, which is 14 years after the flood occurred, and 2,242. Did Methuselah survive the flood? So it's not an easy, simple, natural reading, as Ken Ham said in the debate, that solves the age of the earth. The text is fraught. Genesis 5 is fraught with difficult textual problems. Okay? So what would be the point here in the last 45 seconds? First of all, the longevity of the patriarchs are there to picture a time in the history of the world, according to the author, that belonged to the long ago. That's why they lived so long in the past. Okay? Second, Enoch lives 365 years. Is this a symbolic number? It's 1 year for each day of the year, 365. Lamech lives 777 years, and that's 777. Is this a full life? Enoch is the 7th mentioned on the list. He happened not to die like everybody else because he walked with God. Is the genealogy more of a theological thing? And now I gotta finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Now we'll take a time of discussion. We'll listen to the panelists discuss among themselves for the next 10 minutes.
I wanted to respond to your comment that perhaps what man was for doesn't matter so much for us now. I wanted to look at that from a biological nature lover's point of view, and also look at the question, if evolution isn't true, why do I look like a monkey? And I don't know, I have a picture up on my slide, my PowerPoint. Can I get my PowerPoint? First of all, I want to tell you a story. We do look like monkeys. I mean, if you look at your hands, okay? And if you've ever watched somebody win NASCAR, it looks an awful lot like a triumph display of the great apes, you know?
And some more than others.
And we use the same threat gestures. If you hunch a great ape will threaten another one by hunching forward and glaring. And my niece had just been reading about that when her dad came in and he was scolding her for something, and he said, "Lauren," and she went, "Ee." They do share, so we do belong. I mean, we're clearly mammals. We feed our young milk, we have hair. So what are we doing? And I think that Genesis can address this question in a meaningful way. I mean, doesn't she look like a harassed mom? This is the verse in Genesis, that in Genesis 2:15, where it says, God took man and put him in the garden to work it and to care for it. We were given jurisdiction over it. And the words for work and care for are really comprehensive words. They're words for serving. It's the same one as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the Lord bless you and keep you. Okay? So these are service words. This is C.S. Lewis. Maybe that man was put here to make peace. If we're to tend and keep the earth, I think he incarnated us. And Genesis 1 is telling us our role. He didn't tell us to figure out how he made it. He told us to tend and keep it for him. So every time you look at your hands and you think you look like a monkey, remember perhaps you were incarnated to tend and keep God's earth.
On the question of looking like a monkey, I have on my phone, I'll show anybody who wants to see it afterwards to prove it. I have a photograph of my son who is playing Angry Birds in a very comfortable position for him. That comfortable position is he has both ankles behind his head. There's a story behind that, but he got that in that position himself. We refer to Micah as the monkey. He can do things that mere mortals cannot do. One point I want to mention to Dr. Cunha, one time looking at the, I'm sure it was the Masoretic text numbers, and I just was playing with the numbers, seeing what they showed, and I believe, my recollection is, Noah is the first generation born after Adam died. And I suspect that's a theological comment that essentially there arose a generation that knew not Adam. And I think that's more relevant than trying to figure out exactly how old anybody was at the time. I think it's a theological comment more than a chronological comment. On the issue of the point that you made, Karen, about the Owen and his homologies, a book that I read that addresses extensively the issue of the philosophical issues and difficulties behind the theory of evolution is this book that was published a number of years ago now called Darwin's God by a man named Cornelius Hunter. I get no royalties whatsoever. But it's the one where it discusses the issue of the vestigial organs, and you believe that a penguin is a devolved flighted bird only if you believe in evolution. The point he's really making, and the reason for the title of the book, is whenever people have pointed out to evolutionary theorists the number of times they run into circular arguments, the sort you were identifying, when they run into circular arguments, it's stunning, and Hunter comments on it, the number of times that their response is, well, God wouldn't have made it that way. If special creation is right, God would not have made it that way. And Hunter's point is, well, that's a very interesting thing for you to say, but you need to first admit that's a theological argument, that's not a scientific argument. So if you're willing to admit you've quit doing science and we want to now discuss theology, we'll have that discussion. But they leap over that boundary between science and theology, claiming to do science. And that's, again, one of the philosophical problems that arises on multiple occasions. And the one other comment I'd like to make is, over the years, I've become less and less convinced that, well, we start by saying, I am not now, nor have I ever been, an evolutionist. I have very serious questions that cause me to doubt the validity of at least a materialistic explanation of the origins of life, purely materialistic explanation of the origins of life. but I'm also not convinced that creationism and young earth creationism and 6 24-hour day creationism, I'm not convinced that that's a valuable or worthwhile place to start when having a conversation with an unbeliever, because in a sense what you're asking them to do is, before you believe in God, I need you to believe that God created everything. I believe God created everything, but I'm not sure that's a particularly helpful place to start with someone who does not believe in God in the first place.
So, is the earth old then? Is that what I am saying? I am saying that you cannot figure that out based on using Genesis 1 and the genealogies that you find in the book of Genesis. There's other several reasons for it. That answer needs to be sought in a scientific debate using, I guess, scientific methodology, constructing models of reality that are more likely or less likely, and that's where you should answer that question. Where does the Bible fit then? You know, Karen mentioned the four causes that were brought up by Aristotle, and in fact, I think theology and the Bible and Genesis 1, they're there to answer efficient and final causes. Who created? God. For what purpose? As the function of the Genesis account. But as for formal and material causes of the universe, that belongs to science, for science to deal with. And you can have a dialogue between both of them as long as Bill Nye doesn't make judgment calls on philosophical questions, and perhaps Ken Ham doesn't make judgment calls on scientific questions based on his particular reading of the book of Genesis. Sounds good? I think we're almost done. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to move into our question time. So thank you for those who submitted questions. And we've decided that what we'll do is we'll take 2 minutes. Each panelist will be given 2 minutes to respond to the questions as they've been given. So here are the questions that, or here's the first question that's been given. What is the Christian response to the evolutionary evidence of Neanderthal man?
I volunteered for this question in part because just recently I submitted a cheek swab to have a DNA test done through an organization that's affiliated with the National Geographic Society looking at ethnic genotypes. And they look at they look like 1,800 different markers. And one of the results that came back is that I am 2.2% Neanderthal and 1.4% Denisovan, which is an Asian version of Neanderthal, which makes me about 3.6% caveman. And I'm proud of that, actually. You may have never heard of the Denisovans. That's mostly because it's a fairly recent discovery, and it's in fact, the construct of Denisovan hominids is actually based on one tooth found in Asia from a female. And it seemed to have DNA different from Neanderthals, different from Homo sapiens, and so it's been identified as a new hominid. What is my answer to the evidence for the existence of the Neanderthals? I am not a evolutionary scientist, I'm not an anthropologist, but one of the questions I would have is, one, what is that model based? What are the data behind it? And in the end, the existence of the Neanderthal is, to a large extent, a theoretical construct. It is an answer to the data, but I'm not absolutely convinced it's the answer to the data.
I think the core of that question is really, why were there people before Adam, and how about the fall, and what about how different it was? And I think we're kind of back to making models. The comments about the pre-flood world as being long, long ago, the pre-flood world was very odd. We don't know what an ecosystem would be like without death. We can't imagine it. What do you do with a tiger that's not supposed to eat meat? Okay? And what we can do then is say, well, it's not logical, so it shouldn't have happened. I think that we're back to making models. Instead of being like the people with the elephant and fighting in the corner because this is what I believe and this is what you believe, and so instead we need to listen and check and go back and look. And I think it's way too much fun. I mean, I was actually thinking, I write books sometimes, and I was thinking about writing a sci-fi book about the flood in which the demons do genetic modification, and it actually says Noah was pure in his begetting. Maybe he was the only full human, you know? So the other guys weren't necessarily bad because they didn't get on the ark, they just weren't really human anymore. Anyway, you can have a lot of fun with it, but the main point there is telling us, I think the point of the flood would be, is it safe to thumb your nose at God and to live corruptly? And I think the answer is quite clear. Whether he inundated the earth, I think that would be awesome. Re-terraforming the earth and all the rest of that. We can just about pack an ecosystem up in a box now, and who's to say they weren't high-tech back then? Lots of fun.
Next question. If a purely naturalistic explanation for human origins is correct, then which foundational Christian doctrines, for example, sin, atonement, etc., if any, would be in need of revision or modification?
I think the simplest answer, if a purely naturalist explanation were the likely explanation, then everything about Christianity is gone. The heart of naturalism is to deny that the existence of very God who created the world, who controls the world or provides for the world or is involved with the world. So I guess the simplest answer is that you can get rid of Christianity as a whole. That's what naturalism is all about. But naturalism is really a philosophical worldview about the world that does not need to be necessarily warranted by science. That's why you have theistic scientists who can be just as good of scientists as atheistic scientists. So I guess that's it.
I have a quote from Mary Midgley. "A passionate conviction that there cannot possibly be a mind superior to one's own is not something that can be drawn from science. It seems to be much more like what Stephen Jay Gould briskly calls the representation of raw hope gussied up as rational reality." So if the question was, what would a scientific naturalism, this straight materialism, it denies the existence of God. If you mean, could people have evolved, that God could have created us through evolution, I think then you're back to making models. I don't think we have to be terrified of that idea.
If a purely naturalistic, purely materialistic explanation of the origins of life is correct, then the most God you could come up with that I could see would be a deist God who is perhaps out there somewhere, but completely uninvolved and uninterested in what goes on among us. There could be no incarnation, there could be no giving of the law, there could be none of what we find in the Bible, and so I agree that we would essentially lose everything. On the other hand, if you go with something like intelligent design, you don't really get a whole lot, you aren't a whole lot better off theologically. With many of the theories, you can get that there is a God who at least started the process or superintended the process, but you're nowhere near a God who loved us, came to earth, and died on a cross to save us from our sins. And so no matter what explanation you have for the origins of life, you need much more to come to what we understand as Christian theology.
Thank you. Next question. Bill Nye brought up several points that seemed to contradict the flood, and Ken Ham gave little to no evidence to support the flood. What evidence is there? Bill Nye said that if this evidence could be found, he could be convinced about God.
I'm not convinced that Bill Nye really means that. There were a number of times in the debate that Bill Nye referred to extraordinary claims. Bill Nye graduated with his bachelor's degree in engineering from Cornell University, where a very famous physicist taught and was one of Bill Nye's professors, a man named Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is well known for his statement, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Well, philosophers who specialize in epistemology have analyzed Carl Sagan's comment and what it really means, and have pointed out that Carl Sagan never really was able to identify what kind of extraordinary evidence he would accept. And so it was sort of a way of dismissing all possible explanations that disagreed with him without ever providing a real answer to the question. And so, no, I can't tell you what evidence I can give you for the flood that would convince Bill Nye to believe in God, because in the end, I don't think Bill Nye would really be open to or would believe any evidence that was given to him in support of anything that disagreed with the philosophical structure that he has adopted.
I think perhaps the person was also asking, is there any physical evidence of the flood? And that's an interesting question, because you're back to how do we date things. There's lots and lots of evidence of global catastrophes. I mean, you probably have heard of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs and so on, because the Earth is imprinted with enormous catastrophes. How and when the flood happened and whether it was global is interesting. I don't think the message in the flood is essentially either the material or the efficient. I think we're back out to some other levels where we're looking at the reasons, and I think it's warnings. That doesn't mean there wasn't a global flood. There's a wonderful comment in C.S. Lewis's The Horse and His Boy, where Bree, who's one of the horses, is there pontificating about how Aslan could not have been a lion. It's just not logical. You wouldn't have a predator being God, and so on and so forth. And as he's pontificating logically away, Aslan's whisker tickles his ear. And I think anytime we say, well, it didn't happen this way, because it's not logical, we risk that. Because with science, we're just making observations. With special revelation, it is a word from God, if you are believing in God at all. And that has a different type of understanding to it.
Again, it's an unfair question to use the flood narrative in Genesis to argue for a universal flood, because in a way the flood narrative is there to basically describe the undoing of the world back to its original chaotic form that you find in Genesis 1:2. Genesis 1:2, there's a bunch of waters. It's impossible for human beings to inhabit the world, so God starts actually dividing things to create a world where human beings can live in an orderly world. Because of sin and because of its effects, its misdirections, God then decides to undo the creation, to then redo the creation again. And that's why Noah comes about as sort of a second Adam. God tells Noah what God had told humankind in Genesis 9 to fill and multiply and so on and so forth. So again, you have there more of a theological perspective using the waters of the flood than anything else. And by the way, the word for ark in Genesis, where you know the ark of Noah, is the same word that's used for the little ark of Moses in Exodus chapter 2. That is, Noah functions as sort of a foreshadowing of the liberation of Moses through the chaotic waters, who then functions also as a foreshadowing of the liberation of God's people through the midst of the chaotic waters. So, thank you.
I'd just like to say real quick that I think God is into literal puns. He may use it as an illustration, and it also might be completely the way he said.
Good. Since Bill Nye made a point of questioning and challenging Ken Ham as to why there were no kangaroo fossils along the way from Mount Ararat to Australia, why does the panel think that this is also true of no buffalo fossils in the U.S., although 60 to 100 million once roamed here? Nor are there roadkill fossils.
I have a fossil picture up there if you'll let me get to it. Ah, fossils. As you can see, even by looking at them, they get buried very rapidly in mud. And that's why they can mineralize. If you leave something like roadkill laying there, God has designed the world so everything's recycled. God is really into recycling. If he wasn't, life would stop. So I think when death came, Satan thought he'd won. And instead, God has braided death right into our ecosystem, so life continued for redemption. So you might think of fungus and bacteria as bad guys, but if they weren't around, life would stop. They're the recyclers. So if you're not going to have it recycled, it has to be buried rapidly in mud. So all fossils really are in sedimentary rock, which was old mud. Roadkill didn't get buried in old mud. There are some buffalo bones that were buried rapidly in mud that we do find on occasion. They're not mineralized usually. In fact, I've dug one up. So I'm not sure, just because we don't find it, that's clear that not everything gets fossilized. And whether the fossils happened in Noah's flood is great fun. You can play with that if you want to. I'm not going to play any position on that. One thing about a young earth, God usually obeys his own rules. Natural law is how he does things, by logic. And so very unlikely is it that he's going to fool us by making the world look old and really be young. It's the old, does Adam have a belly button thing? Did he look like he was born? And if he was going to play that game, we could all be 1 minute old. We just got put here with memories that collaborate with each other's. So I'm a little wary of the appearance of an old earth that's really young. It doesn't seem like it would be consistent with how God does things.
I just wanted to add that this last summer my family went out west and we visited the Petrified Forest National Park, where they have petrified wood, and the explanation of that, it was a flood. It was buried very quickly, and so that's where we get the fossils, even fossilized wood.
One thing that is very clear in the fossil record is there are big gaps between kinds, and how that fits in exactly. This is one quote. This is more like what the fossil record looks like. All those dotted lines are theorized or hypothesized how this might have got here from that. And they keep having to go back. It was really funny. We found an ancient bird, older than all other birds. Darn, it's a duck. That was in Nature magazine a while ago. So they say Archaeopteryx was the ancestor of birds. Well, it's younger than other bird fossils that they've tried to age seem to be. So how and when and how the fossils work, I mean, you can talk to a geologist on that one.
All right. Ham said that we cannot know the origins of the earth. We cannot do historical science. Then he says that 90% of radiometric techniques point to a young earth. Aren't these two statements at least inconsistent? And are either of them valid?
They are inconsistent. No, you
Ham went on and on saying that you can't do science in the past. There's two different types of science you can do. One is with the scientific method, where you go count and set up a control thing. You can't do that in the past. You can observe and come to logical conclusions. There's two types of science. One is the actual scientific method, where you control it. The other is deduction from observation. And that certainly applies to the past, but it has presuppositions.
And I would add that, as I see it, the value in what Ken Ham was doing was at least to point out that there are methodological problems in some of the dating techniques that are used. If you use this technique, you get one answer. You apply that same technique over here. He gave the example of the lava dome in Mount St. Helens that clearly is not, however old the dating said it was. It at least points us to the fact that there are uncertainties in our methodology that we at least need to exercise humility, no matter which side we're on.
But I could turn this over to Dr. Ball, and he could explain why it looks very clearly as though both the universe and the Earth herself are old. However, how that fits in, I'm not really willing to die on that rock. I think the message in Scripture is He made us. And He is not the God of the gaps that wound up the world. In Him we live and move and have our being. He is creating. He's the one in whom we hold together.
I think the last question for this evening is, why do secular scientists like Bill Nye think that a biblical worldview could hurt the pursuit of knowledge and scientific exploration?
I don't know.
I think it's the problem of miracles. If you're going to have, historically people have said it was an act of God whenever they didn't get it. And in insurance, they'll still say something like lightning is an act of God. And there is a presupposition that God only does things you don't understand, as if he isn't acting through his own world, in which Scripture says, through him we live and move and have our being. He says the young lions roar for food and God gives it to them. He looks away and they die and go back to the dust. So I think they're afraid of miracles, and you can't do science if you never know what will happen next. But God is consistent, and most of the time, and maybe all the time, obeys his own rules. It may be that when he does miracles, he's obeying his own rules in ways we don't understand yet. I'd love to have known when Jesus broke the bread and feeding the 5,000, whether the carbon dioxide was just sucking out of the air into the bread really fast, like photosynthesis. It'd be useful to know that trick.
But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." There is this human desire, at least a fallen human desire, to have answers for everything, to know everything. I think that's part of the answer to why Bill Nye says what he says, that if we allow for the existence of God, we have to admit that we cannot know everything. And that's a philosophical commitment, a metaphysical commitment on the part of Bill Nye. It is not a scientific commitment. But it's one by which he chooses to live, in spite of the inherent contradictions in it, having to do with concepts of justice, etc. And so, because he has that metaphysical, philosophical conviction that we must be, at least in principle, able to know everything, then anyone who claims we cannot know everything is a threat to him and his view of the world.
All right, what we've done now is we've reserved the last remaining minutes of our time together for panelist closing remarks. So we've set aside 3 minutes for each of the panelists to make any closing remarks.
There is a story in the Gospel of Mark that I will paraphrase. Jesus goes into the region of Tyre and Sidon, and there in a home he encounters a Syrophoenician woman. The woman comes before Jesus and says, "My daughter has an unclean spirit." Jesus says to her, "It is not right to give the children's food to the dogs." To which she responds, "But the dogs may eat the scraps that fall from the children's table." And Jesus says, "You have answered well. Go, your daughter will be healed." And when the woman gets home, her daughter is indeed cleansed of this unclean spirit. That story sounds to us as 21st century Americans as a very harsh story. We don't like that story very much because Jesus calls the woman a dog. And in case you're not aware of this, in first century Near Eastern culture, calling a woman a dog was an insult. Not that it's much of a compliment today. So he calls her a dog, and when she acknowledges her canine characteristics, then Jesus says, "Okay, since you admit you're a dog, I will give you what you asked for." The story sounds horrible to us. Jesus insults the woman, and when she inhabits the insult, Jesus then gives in. We read the story that way because we simply do not understand the culture, we don't understand the world. We have a construct of the world in which this conversation is taking place, and our construct is completely wrong. The fact is, what Jesus is supposed to do in that world is to completely ignore the woman from the very beginning. She is beneath his dignity. He should not acknowledge her existence. She has challenged him. He's supposed to ignore her. by answering her in any way, Jesus has said, this woman is my social peer. She deserves an answer. She then responds, he responds back, and the whole encounter is demonstrated to everyone in the room. This woman, Jesus considers to be his peer, and he ultimately grants her request and demonstrates that he is who he claimed to be, and that this Gentile woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit, she is worthy of my concern. So in the end, the story actually means the opposite of what it seems to mean to us. We read texts, we look at evidence through our lenses, through our models, through our constructs. And that, in the end, is, I guess, the big problem I have with Bill Nye is that he is not aware that he is looking at the world through a particular set of presuppositions that lead him to conclusions that make sense within his system, but they may not be true.
I guess the thing I want to leave with you is, like you said at the beginning, a sense of joy and beauty. I think I have these.
Yeah.
Looking at variations on themes, these are all different types of dogs from a wolf. God put a lot of variety into each gene pool, and he had so much fun with it. You can see you can select for information present from the Chihuahua and the Great Dane, they're all there. And here you have horses, and you can play with the horse gene pool and come up with all kinds of different horses, but there's limits to it. Past a certain amount of small, you end up losing most of your colts because they're breeding for extreme dwarfism. There's limits to that kind of selection, and Darwin couldn't see the limits. But what I also want to say is that God did things, apparently, to create beauty by variations on themes. If you're a musician, you'll know that variations on themes make beauty in music. You take a phrase, you invert it, you repeat it, you slow it down, you speed it up. In visual art, the same thing happens. They'll repeat a pattern. And I think when you get back to the vestigial, supposedly, or different things, I think God's playing with variations. You've got the basic mammal skeleton. What can we do with it? Well, we can stretch it into a giraffe and turn it into a bat, or change it into a bird, and he's just having a blast with the basic vertebrate skeleton. And by the way, penguins do fly. They just fly underwater. And they fly really well underwater. Awesome. They just need a paper out about how they use a fine surface level of bubbles, squeeze it out of their feathers for that last 200-yard dash past the leopard seals back onto the edge. Beautiful design. And God made us to tend and keep his earth. We're to be between, as C.S. Lewis says, the angels and the beasts, who are jesters and playfellows. So instead of arguing about how we made it, let's enjoy it. Man's chief aim is to glorify God and enjoy it forever. And not only that, to keep it in his name, which is what we were made for, as Genesis said. To be his, what word did you say? As vice regents, thank you, here on earth.
I love that you're quoting me, Karen. You're in the right path. My concluding remarks are this. What a biblical text says is as important as how it says it. And how it says it dictates how it should be read and interpreted. Okay? It's an issue of content and form. What some call a natural reading of the Bible, that's arguable. Because a natural reading of the biblical text is a reading that pay attention and respects how the text says what it says, and not other way around. And when you do that with Genesis, and you're talking about this orange debate, for me the Bible belongs to questions like the Heidelberg Catechism first question. What is your only comfort in life and death? That I'm not my own, but belong in body and soul to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. That's the true reality to which the Bible belongs and speaks to. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists for joining us this evening, and very enlightening. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Steve Ball. He has some closing remarks, I believe, and some thoughts. Thank you, guys.
Really appreciate hearing from our panelists this evening. I'm sure you do as well. We're thinking about holding another event sometime in April. Some of you, raise your hand if you remember Dr. Dennis Venema, who came here nearly 4 years ago. Hold it up high if you do. There's a couple. Oh, there's a few of you. Okay, some of you were here then. Just admitted how long you've been at LeTourneau. Well, anyway, we're thinking about inviting Dr. Venema back, and he recommended a counterpart who would give an opposing viewpoint, Dr. Todd Wood, a creationist who also works in biology, a geneticist as well. And how many of you, I'd like to see your hands, would be interested in hearing from both of them? Come on, raise your hand. Oh, that's encouraging. Okay, so this is something we're very interested in doing sometime in April. We'll try to get back to you soon on that. And again, we do this, and our panelists have come out tonight because we're interested in helping you process how science and our faith can meaningfully fit together. And these guys and gals, they didn't make a dime by coming here to do this. They're here because of you. And so please give them a hand. And hope to see you back in April for our next event. Good night.
Thank you. What did you think of the debate?
I didn't actually watch the debate.
What did you think of the panel discussion about the debate you didn't see?
It was very good.
Was it?
Yes.
The Longview News Journal reporter was here a little while ago, and he wanted me to get some student comments. Would you have a comment to make about the event?
Janet, here's one of my students from the Senior Science and Faith Club. He's supposed to be knowledgeable in things like this.
This one tonight.
I
mean, did you enjoy his?
She wants to get comments from
Did you enjoy having that opportunity?